Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to our November Climate Cafe. This is the last one of the year, she says. Thank goodness for that. We've been running them every month for the past year, and we had 5 or 6 during Great Big Green Week. So this is the end of a big year for us. I'm Chris Lee, we haven't met you before, and I'm part of Fairer World Linfield, which is a community action group raising awareness and encouraging practical and collective action for the climate and ecological crisis. We've been going for about 3 years now, and our monthly climate cafes have been on a wide range of subjects, and if you want to catch up with those, you'll find them on our Facebook page. Tonight we're doing something a bit different. We're holding this in partnership with another climate group, another local Sussex climate group called Greening Stenning, and they have another group called Green Books. So I'd like to introduce you to Paul Hannon, who's a member of that group, and he's going to tell you a little bit about what they get up to. Thank you, Paul.
Yep. Good evening, I'm Paul Hannon. I'm co-chair of Greening Stenning, and I think Jeff Barnard, my other co-chair, is on tonight as well. So hi, Jeff. So Green Books is something we set up a year ago, and 8 months out of the last 12, we've had speakers on a whole range of environmental topics, from wildlife to gardening, to environmental psychology and climate change. And we're very happy to be working with our friends in Linfield tonight.
Okay, thank you, Paul. We'll be hearing a bit more from you and what you're doing in the future later on. But I'm just going to get straight into it because I don't want to run too late. I'm delighted, really delighted that Jeremy Williams is with us tonight. I heard him speak some months ago at an event that the International Development Agency called Tearfund was running, and I felt really challenged by his talk, and immediately went out and bought his book. Several copies actually, which I've given away, and I've read it twice. And that's not because, Jeremy, I didn't understand it. I did. You write with such clarity, and it's a small book, and it's got spaces between the lines, which I love, you know, it's little sections, so it's really easy to read. But what it did was really deepen my awareness of this really important issue, really opened my eyes to it. And I think it's a very brave book to write, particularly with a title like that, Climate Change is Racist. And that was quite hard for us to promote, but I think it's got to a few people, perhaps to do with COP26 and what's been happening there the last couple of weeks. So I just want to thank you for that and being brave enough to write this book. And I'm going to hand over to you and let you introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you all for joining us this evening. And thank you to Fairer World, Linfield and Green Too Much. I'm planning to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions after that. To kick us off, just to say a little bit about myself and how I came to this topic. I grew up in Madagascar and then in Kenya, and certainly in Madagascar, it was one of the poorest countries in the world at the time, in the 80s and 90s, and it still is. And living there, I saw up close all kinds of environmental damage that was happening there, from deforestation, the effect of cyclones, drought, and saw how those things affected people who already had very little. And having seen that, when I learned about climate change, which wasn't until much later at university, I immediately understood it as a justice issue. And so I always understood climate justice. And a little bit later, I came to understand that there was a racial dimension to that as well, which I hadn't seen at first. And what I want to do is I want to show you what I saw when I first realized there was a racist dynamic to climate change. I'm going to show you the same graphics, just redrawn slightly. And I'm going to go to my presentation, see if I can call that up. Hopefully that will work. Share screen. Okay, so you should be able to see that. So I'm going to show you 2 maps, and these 2 maps, I put them together I'd never seen them side by side, and I put them in this presentation, and then the injustice kind of jumped out to me. So this is the first one. Oh. So this is a map of carbon emissions per capita, and it shows where in the world people have the highest carbon footprints. So red shows the highest footprint, those who are most responsible for the breakdown of the climate. And the darker the green, the less the citizens of that country have contributed to the crisis. I must apologize to anyone who's colorblind, by the way. I forgot all about that when I was drawing these up. I realize they're not ideal for everybody. Just to mention China quickly there, big yellow country on the right of that map. China is the world's biggest emitter of carbon emissions, but because it also has a very large population, then when you look at it on a per capita basis, it's a bit more moderate than you might expect. Map number 2 is a map of climate vulnerability. Now, this is measured by Notre Dame University in the States, and it shows where the climate crisis is going to hurt most. So here, green indicates relative safety, and then orange to red shows mounting risk. So it's the red and the orange countries that we can really consider to be the front lines of climate change, if we want to use that metaphor. Now, if we put those two side by side, you realize that they are almost negatives of each other. In the first one, there's this green band across the middle and the red top and bottom, and then they swap over in the second map. And what that shows us is that there's really stark disconnect between the causes of climate change and its consequences. So those who are most responsible for damaging the atmosphere face lower risks, and the greatest dangers are falling on those who are least responsible. And that fundamentally is the injustice of climate change. But there are several different injustices at work in this. So part of it is simply geography. It's much hotter around the equator, and so global warming is naturally going to mean more in Sudan than it is in Sweden. That stands to reason. We have the luxury of living in a temperate part of the world, but if you're in an arid region, it's going to be much more serious. Often when we draw the Earth, we draw it like this, as this two-tone green and blue. And you see this on the front cover of environmental books and protest signs and so on, often with phrases like one world or there is no planet B. But of course, the world doesn't look like that. If we look at it from space, we realize that it's not blue and green at all. There are top and bottom, there are white areas, and there are large sandy areas across the middle. Only parts of the world are green, including Britain. And climate change is going to mean different things in each of these places. So at the top of the world, Arctic communities are already suffering from warming temperatures, and that is completely changing the landscape that they live in, and therefore changing their way of life. And the indigenous activist Sheila Watt-Cloutier wrote a book called The Right to be Cold that describes this very eloquently. You've also got ways of life being completely changed in those sandy colored parts of the world, where more heat is going to mean potentially drought and famine and desertification, and then potentially displacement. So there's this geographical injustice to climate change. Not all the world is green and temperate like it is in Britain. In some ways, we're the lucky ones there. And if we come back to our map comparison again, there's a second inequality that we can see quite visibly in this map, and that's the economic one. So there's a rich and poor divide going on here. This is widely recognized now. I noticed a speech from Boris Johnson a few weeks ago where he said, it is the biggest economies in the world that are causing the problem, while the poorest suffer the worst consequences. So that's got through to Boris Johnson. And we can see that wealth divide on the map. Richer countries use more energy, they buy more stuff, they have higher carbon footprints. Poorer countries are using far less energy, have a disproportionate impact. There are two sides to this though, because while the rich are most responsible, they face lower risk. And that's partly because they are more likely to live in those temperate parts of the world, but also because you have the money to protect yourself. So if it starts to get hotter and hotter in a rich country, well, then you're going to buy air conditioning. And the poorest can't afford those sorts of adaptations. If disaster does strike, in places like Britain, we have social safety nets that would look after people, and we have the money to rebuild. And again, those aren't always available to people. So climate change is disproportionately caused by the richest. vastly disproportionately caused by the richest, but mainly suffered by the poorest. And so that's the economic injustice of climate change. And these aren't superficial differences. These are really quite profound inequalities. I want to highlight a contrast between two countries that I have a connection to. So my mum is from Australia, and I have Australian citizenship, even though I've never actually been there. Don't tell them. And Australians have enormous carbon footprints, 16 tons per person per year. That's mainly to do with over-dependence on coal. And then there's Madagascar, where I spent my childhood. And in Madagascar, average carbon footprints are 0.16 tons per person per year. That's not difficult maths. Australia's carbon footprints are 100 times bigger than those in Madagascar. To put that another way, it takes 100 Malagasy people to have the same impact on the planet as just one Australian. Madagascar in this map here is darkest green for having some of the lowest carbon footprints in the world. But in that second map, it would appear red for being one of the top 10 most vulnerable places on the planet. And this is not theoretical. If you've been following the news this year, you'll know that there's currently a famine in the south of Madagascar. There are 4 places in the world currently experiencing a famine. 3 of those are because of conflict. Madagascar's famine is caused by climate change. So this is a real and live situation for them. It's the reality. But there's more going on here. We come back to our 2 maps for the third and final time. If we look at these maps and we consider race. So in that first map, what color skin do most people have in those countries that are colored red? And with some exceptions, it's hard to escape the fact that climate change has been mainly caused by people with fair skin, like mine. The inequality is more stark in that second map if we ask who bears the greatest risk from climate change, and it's very clearly people of color. And we see this band of vulnerability that runs across that map from the Caribbean and across Africa into the Middle East, India, and out towards Asia and the Pacific. And where that map is most red and the danger is greatest is among the Black populations of Africa. So this is the racial injustice of climate change. It doesn't get mentioned very often. It's not something that comes up very often, at least not in the circles that I tend to move in. And because it's overlooked, it is the reason why I wanted to look into it and why I wrote the book, Climate Change is Racist. But there's no question, and you've alluded to this already, that does ring alarm bells for people. And a lot of reactions to that book title is, well, hang on a second, how can climate change be racist? That doesn't make any sense. And so it's important to understand that there is more than one kind of racism. A lot of the time when we talk about racism, what we're referring to is racial prejudice, and that is the actions and opinions of racists. So we know what that looks like with racist football chants or offensive comments on the internet, those sorts of things. But very few people openly identify as this kind of racist because it's not socially acceptable. But if that's our only understanding of racism, we can tend to think that there isn't a problem with it anymore. And you get those glib statements from politicians when people say things like, oh, Britain isn't a racist country. That's not a problem anymore. But there's clearly something deeper going on, because even though most people wouldn't consider themselves to be racist, there are still visible racial inequalities that persist in things like education, or in policing and sentencing, or in healthcare. To give one example of that I came across earlier this year, the fact that Black women in Britain are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. This is in 2021 in Britain. How is that possible? And it can't be because midwives are racist. It's not to do with prejudice at this point. There's something deeper going on. And why is that still happening? And the reasons are obviously very complex, but what they point to is that there are wider forms of racism. And one of those is institutional racism. And this is something that kind of rose to prominence during the Stephen Lawrence inquiry a few years ago, which was that case where a Black teenager was murdered and the police mishandled the investigation because he was Black, and they found that the Metropolitan Police had a problem with institutional racism. And the way they defined that is the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. The idea of institutional racism itself goes back a good deal further than that. And it was first coined by Charles Hamilton and Kwame Ture in the 1960s. And the example they give is one that I really like. They said that when somebody throws stones at a Black family's windows, that's individual racism. When that family can't get a mortgage to buy the house in the first place, that's institutional racism. And I think that's really helpful. But there is a third kind of racism, which we can layer on top of that. It's bigger than individual prejudice and institutional racism, and that's structural racism. And these are the patterns of disadvantage that emerge from the overall functioning of the system, often accumulated over centuries. So this is inequality at its broadest, and also at its most invisible, because it unfolds through structural things rather than through people and their actions necessarily. Problem with structural racism is that often the explicit prejudice behind it happened a long time ago, and it doesn't need visible racism to keep it going. And so the American sociologist Howard Winant writes that racism must be understood in terms of its consequences, not as a matter of intentions or beliefs. And so this is what I'm talking about when I say that climate change is racist. It's not that climate change has racist opinions. It's not a person. It doesn't have opinions. It can't have prejudices. But outcomes from climate change divide along racial lines. And so climate change is an example of structural racism. It's really important to understand that it's not about intent when we're talking about structural racism. There's no committee of people who want to oppress people of color by disrupting the climate, as far as we know. But we can identify racism by its outcomes. So the climate crisis is going to harm Black and brown people more, while they've contributed less to the problem. And so there is a racial injustice there. There's a Puerto Rican scholar called Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and he describes structural racism as racism without racists, because it can endure without anyone deliberately perpetuating it. And that's why campaigners often say that it isn't enough to make sure that we aren't racists ourselves, because we could get everyone in the world to stop being prejudiced, but the inequality would endure because it's so embedded. And so we have to be proactively anti-racist. And we can talk more, if you want to, later about what that means. But one way to be anti-racist is to pay close attention to the power dynamics in the climate debate. So who's heard, whose stories are being told, whose solutions are being implemented. When decisions are made in Glasgow at COP26 recently in the climate negotiations, whose needs were prioritized and whose needs were at the bottom of the agenda. And I think when we look at how the injustices of climate change have come about, we have to go back hundreds of years actually to see how those have developed and how those have become embedded in the structures of the global economy. So I want to take us on a little bit of a historical detour. It's not a detour, a historical, whatever this is, to illustrate the point. This is an image that you might have seen before if you're lucky. I have to, one of these has never crossed my palms, but a few years ago, if you came into possession of a £50 note, then you would have seen these two serious looking gentlemen on the reverse of it. And one of them is James Watt, who began his engineering career just down the road from where COP26 was held in Glasgow the other week. And the other is Matthew Boulton, the Birmingham industrialist. And between them is their famous steam engine. This is the iconic machine of the Industrial Revolution. You'll find it has pride of place in the Science Museum if you go in there. If you remember the opening ceremony of the London Olympic Games, there was that bit where the huge chimneys kind of rose out of the ground, and they had several of these engines that rose out of the ground as well. So it's something that we're very proud of as part of our industrial heritage. This was a machine that changed the world because it's what launched the widespread use of coal power, and it shaped world history, including ultimately and also unwittingly sowing the seeds of the climate crisis that we are trying to address today. But here's an interesting fact about that. In order to get their machines manufactured, Boulton and Watt had to take out a loan from a bank. And the bank that they used was funded by slave plantations in the West Indies. And so right from the start, with those first machines, the Industrial Revolution was paid for, at least in part, by slavery. And it doesn't stop with Bolton and Watt, of course. When slavery was abolished in 1833, the slave owners, not the slaves, the slave owners, were compensated for their loss. And the Treasury compiled a really detailed record of who owned slaves and where they were in order to pay the compensation. And that was secret for a long time. And then it was made public in 2013. And you can browse those records online. There's a really fascinating project, which you can look up another time. What those records show is that the profits of slavery were plowed into railways, into industry, and to banking. And so the capital for the Industrial Revolution came from slavery. And I think one of the big differences between the race debate in Britain and the race debate in the US is it's much more obvious and immediate in the US. The British public were always able to keep slavery at arm's length because it happened so far away, it happened in the colonies. But indirectly, slavery did reach right to our doorsteps, and the legacy of it is still there if you look. I was looking up Luton, where I live, on this database, and found that just 5 minutes down the road from me is Crawley Green Road, which is named after the Crawley family. Samuel Crawley was an investor in coffee plantations in Granada and is the listed owner of 74 slaves. I could tell you other stories, 5 minutes in the other direction, and there are similar situations up and down the country. Slavery and colonialism were openly racist policies and processes. But centuries later, we see the same racial injustices echoed in climate change. It was the stolen labor of Black and brown people that kickstarted the Industrial Revolution. And then the long-term effects of industrialization in the form of climate change get dumped back on Black and brown people at the end of the process. So racial injustice runs all the way through this story. A story of white power taking what it wants, taking people, taking land and resources, and now taking the atmosphere. And so when we look at this history, it's important to see that the climate emergency isn't unfolding in a neutral world. It's unfolding in a historical context, in the context of existing power imbalances, in the context of hundreds of years of white supremacy. And so it can't help but compound and reinforce those existing inequalities and injustices. And when we look at the potential effects of climate change, we can see that existing global injustices are going to be compounded by the climate crisis, and that far more Black and brown people will be affected. I just wanted to show you another set of maps. I hope you don't mind maps. These are 4 different impacts of climate change that reinforce this point that people of color are going to be more affected. And I'll just run through them quickly. At the top there, we have heat risk. Now, what this map shows is the number of days per year that temperatures will rise into the category of deadly heat by 2050. Deadly heat is when it gets so hot that the natural mechanisms that the body has to cool down, like sweating, for example, are no longer enough to cool you down. And if you were to stay outside unprotected, you would die in that heat. Now, you can survive that if you can cool down, if you can take a cold shower, or you can get into an air-conditioned room and so on. But you can imagine how if you have several days in a row of deadly heat, how do you run a city? How do you go to school? How do you farm? How do people function if you get several days in a row? And what happens if you're dependent on air conditioning and you have a power cut? Very serious consequences to deadly heat. If we look at the distribution of that risk, it's not really white people who are going to suffer from that. Closely connected to that, if we drop down to the next map, is the crop failure. The countries that are in red on this map are places that are likely to experience harvest losses because of climate change, partly because of heat, but also because of increased drought and so on. If we look at some of those places, they're often places such as Central Africa or India that already face food security issues. There's going to be a lot of hunger associated with climate change. And again, the distribution of that is mainly among Black and brown people. If we look at cyclones, this map shows the cyclone path of every cyclone for the last 50 years. And again, we see the same places hit again and again. So the Caribbean and Central America, almost invisible under that blaze of green there. I've highlighted Madagascar because Madagascar would be invisible without it. It's in the red there. Madagascar has a cyclone season. It is hit every single year by cyclones. The science on climate change suggests that there won't be more cyclones, but the ones that you get will be more intense. So that's a very real risk for the Caribbean islands and for places like Madagascar, places like the Philippines and so on over in Asia as well. And then finally, the fourth map, and this one's the kicker really. I sometimes debate whether to put this one into presentations or not because it feels so heavy. But if you put all these sorts of things together, you can basically see that some parts of the world are no longer going to be able to support settled communities. It will be impossible to grow crops or to raise livestock, and those places will become essentially uninhabitable. And if you look at this map, places that are considered uninhabitable today are in black. And so as you can see, they're mainly in the Sahara Desert, and none of us would argue with that. The shaded areas are parts of the world that could be uninhabitable by 2070. It's a third of the world that's shaded there. There are 3.5 billion people who live within those shaded areas. And of those 3.5 billion people, a small fraction of them will be white people. I had a look at this map and I tried to work out if there were any majority white cities in those shaded areas. And the only one I could find was Darwin in the north of Australia. So this is hugely disproportionate. And even if this projection is wrong, this is obviously a projection, we don't know what's going to happen in 2070. But even if they're half right, and it's half of 3.5 billion, we're still talking about an unimaginable total of human suffering here. It's vast. It's hard to get your head around it. There are similar estimates from something called the Climate Vulnerability Monitor, which estimates that by 2030, it's not very far away, 80% of the economic costs of climate change and 99% of the mortality will fall in the global south. And if we were to think about that 99% mortality in a different way, it suggests basically that 99 Black and brown people are going to die from climate change for every one white person. So do Black lives matter? This is the question we have to ask ourselves. Or will the powerful consider them disposable in the way that previous eras did under slavery and under empire? And these are hard things to talk about. I understand that. But unless we curb emissions very soon and avoid these kinds of scenarios, then history is going to see climate change as a new chapter in a very long and sorry history of racial injustice. And perhaps you can see at this point why I've talked about slavery and empire in a talk about climate change, because I think this is the great injustice of our generation, of our time. And just as previous eras, people were called to stand up to apartheid or to the slave trade, or to choose whether they would join and march with the civil rights movement, for example, I think climate change speaks to us in the same way. And it says, this is the injustice of our time. What role are we going to play? On the more positive side, the intersection of climate change and race has been highlighted by a growing number of people and organizations. The Fridays for the Future school strikers are really leading the way on anti-racist approaches to climate change. When I started writing the book, there weren't any books about climate change and race, and there's several on their way. So this thing is beginning to change. And what we can see is that our fight for a sustainable world is going to complement the fight for social justice. They're going to go together. Our response to climate change can prioritize the needs of the poorest and help to create a fairer world. We are going to have to talk more about justice, about reparations, and about atonement for past wrongs, I think. And these are things that we can participate in as individuals, but much more so if we act as communities. And the most important thing above all is to talk about it, which is what I'd like to do now as we move into time for questions.
Great, Jeremy. Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, I agree with absolutely everything you said. And I think one of the challenges is that when we talk about the environment, there's a tendency for people to want to talk about electric cars, solar energy, wildlife, animals, going vegetarian, all of which are important. But the fact is, as you rightly say, climate change is a product of a deeply unfair, unjust economic, political, and social system. But the question is, how do we get that across? Because I find that a lot of people are overwhelmed thinking about the scale of change to get down to the structural issues that you refer to. So in your conversations, Jeremy, how do you go about this?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because it is so big. And the way I presented it there, I'm talking about something which stretches back hundreds of years into the past, and that is going to stretch forward for the rest of my lifetime into the future. That is overwhelming, and that is only one perspective, obviously. And in order to not be overwhelmed by that, it is really important to talk about practical steps and what we can do on our own doorsteps and in our own lives as well. So I think it's really important to have multiple conversations going on, and to have local organizations like your own that can point people to immediate things they can do in their own communities. But the more we can connect those things up, the better, I think. And people often ask, well, I know that my small actions aren't going to make any great difference and so on. But I find that thinking that the small actions that I take, I think they do make a difference, but I can also do them in solidarity with those who are suffering in other places. And that, I think, adds an extra charge and an extra energy for me to motivate me towards those smaller changes. So we have to hold them together, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things perhaps you've noticed about the environmental movement, particularly in Europe and North America, is it's still dominated. It's not particularly inclusive. It's not particularly diverse. You look at Green Party. And why is that? And what can we do about that to make it more inclusive?
Yes, there's some really important work happening, particularly in the States. And if I haven't gone into it in detail tonight, but there's a whole environmental justice movement in the States, which we don't really have in the UK in the same way. There's also a greater awareness of representation within the environmental movement. And there's a project called Green 2.0, which has been measuring the number of, measuring diversity basically in the environmental movement, and demanding that groups do better and be more proactive in increasing their representation. And I'd like to see some of that across the pond, and you know, there's things that we can learn from there. It is a real issue, and I'm not sure I have any answers on that one. It keeps coming up. How do we get greater representation in the environmental movement? And it's certainly come up in every environmental meeting that I've ever been part of. People have been aware that it's too white. What I always want to say is, why do we expect people of color to come to us if we're not coming to them? So if we're not, if they could be having the same meetings about racism and about inequality and saying, where are all the white people? So it's about dialogue, it's about relationship, and about not always wanting to recruit people to our cause, but believing in other people and working together. And again, it will take a long time to change, but I think it is beginning to change.
Okay, I've got some questions in chat here, and here's first one. Would the injustice be addressed if the promised billions of COP were released? And were you encouraged by any progress being made in Glasgow? Well, that'd be an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about this a little bit in the book, because there's a story behind that 100 million. It's much less than was asked for. It's much less than it will cost those poorer countries to adapt. And it was in 2009 at the Copenhagen talks that Africa decided to negotiate as a bloc to demand payments for adaptation. And they were completely sidelined. And I kind of tell the story of that in the book. That 100 million is not enough, and we still can't deliver, you know, that, even though it's been promised. It's a starting point. It's all it is. The other thing is that money is about adaptation. So richer countries still get to cast themselves as the heroes. Here are the countries that are struggling, and here's the money that we're giving them to help them. What wasn't talked about at COP26 nearly as much was loss and damage, which is about compensation for the fact that richer countries caused this harm. That, at that point, you're no longer the heroes riding to the rescue to save people from climate change. You're now taking responsibility for having caused it, and that's much harder. I'm not surprised that that conversation is going slower, but until we start having that conversation, there won't be justice. It's just, it's helping, but we're not really delivering justice.
No. Okay. Now, the next question, something I'm very interested in. What are the projections for mass migrations from southern to northern countries, and what are changes, small and large, we can make to prepare for this movement of people? And just one observation here, 10 years ago, the Pentagon released a report saying that climate change would probably be the biggest cause of conflict in the 21st century, which is quite remarkable, but not many people saw that in the UK. But what's your view on mass migration, Jeremy?
Yes, it's a really tricky one because it's so easily co-opted by movements I wouldn't want to support. And people often talk about the risk of eco-fascism. So, for example, you might have right-wing politicians and movements that have ignored climate change for decades and then suddenly realize that climate change is going to cause a migration problem, and suddenly they're interested, and the result is even more of turning back the boats and putting up walls, and that rush to protectionism and protecting ourselves from these imagined invaders, even though it would be the rich countries that caused that migration with their carbon emissions. So I'm very concerned about both the migration itself and the ugly responses that we might get in the richer countries, of not just failing to take responsibility for our emissions, but turning away the people whose land we have destroyed. There's no easy answers to it. It's something that will unfold over generations and over the coming century or so. But it's important to talk about it now so that we are able to respond with compassion and with generosity. And like you say earlier, with the 100 billion, and with helping people to adapt and paying the compensation that people deserve, helping people to stay in the lands where they were born and where they live now and where they are raising their families. That's got to be the priority. And avoiding those conflicts. When I lived in Kenya, I saw situations where people had moved off of traditional pasture lands, and you had conflicts where people had already been displaced by drought and so on, just on a small scale. And that happening at a global scale is quite a terrifying prospect. And so, yes, keeping people in places where they live and that they call home is going to be very important.
Definitely. Here's a question. In public discussion, how much should the need for action from developed nations to aid the global south be framed as restorative justice for historic exploitation, rather than our generosity to those who have the misfortune to be in difficulty? Would such framing, what's the question, sir? Would such framing cause even more pushback from the majority of people in the north, and how to bring them to change of heart, metanoia? Well, there's quite a lot in there. Perhaps you'd.
Yes, well, I did just touch on that, and that the distinction between the payments that make us look good, that make us look charitable when we pay for adaptation, and the payments as compensation as part of the loss and damage conversation. Those conversations aren't happening about compensation at the international level at the moment, but the calls for them are getting louder and louder just below that. They will come back, and they will keep coming back, and they will keep coming back until they're addressed. What I find more complicated, and this is something I'm trying to learn from my friends who are more involved in this than I am, is how you bring together the calls for compensation for climate change with existing calls for compensation for empire and for slavery and for reparations. And there's a risk that those older grievances, which are still live issues, will kind of get buried behind climate change, because it's even harder to talk about empire and slavery. So the way that it's done has to be done very sensitively to those conversations, and that's about listening. That's not something that I'm in any position to have an opinion on, really. I'm still learning. I do know people who hold them together and who see the processes of climate change as one story with colonialism, and the idea of extracting what you need from developing countries and dumping things you don't want back into them. It's all one story. I've heard from others who say they have to be kept separate. And so I don't know. That's something that I need to learn more about.
Yeah, no, it's complex. Here's another question. Is it more nuanced within the green areas on the vulnerability map? Within those countries, I'm assuming race, among other factors, affect vulnerability. For example, in the States, where there's a mass discrepancy between different areas.
Yes, there's going to be, whenever you look at a map that's color-coded by country, you're obviously working with averages, and there are going to be lots of other forms of inequality within those areas. Is that what the question is getting at, do you think?
Yeah, I think so, especially in the States, where there's such a big difference between areas, but it could be other countries as well, yeah.
Yes, so, well, that's true. So there is a chapter in the book that looks at environmental injustices more locally, and learns in particular from the environmental justice movement in the States, where there are all kinds of examples of where Black communities find themselves facing a pollution problem or a noise problem or something which white communities don't have. We don't have that kind of research in the UK, nearly to the same degree. It's far harder to find information about it, and that's something I would love to see, is some more research going into environmental justice in the UK. But definitely there are distinct problems, and those vary immensely. So there are very distinctive problems in America, but you could also look at the caste system in India, and there are any marginalized group in any country will be further disadvantaged by climate change. And there's a little section in the book where I talk about some of those other communities that will be marginalized in different ways. I'm going to say hello to Peterson, who's on the call here. I met Peterson at Greenbelt a few years ago, and he explained to me how LGBTQ communities can be disadvantaged by climate change, which is something that never crossed my mind. But that went into the book. So thank you, Peterson, for your insights on that one.
Brilliant. There's a comment here. I wonder what you thought. One thing that I would like to see is that all COP and related meetings are in the countries that are most impacted. It seems like a very reasonable observation. What are your thoughts on that?
On which countries are most affected?
Yeah, the COP shouldn't be held in the rich Western countries like the UK or Italy.
Yes, it does cycle around. So it's in Egypt next. It's a tricky one, because what tends to happen is when the COP is held somewhere which is considered to be more dangerous to visit or less desirable to visit, then world leaders are more reluctant to go, which again is a problem. And so holding it in places that have great facilities, that are easy to fly into, places that people want to visit, does bring together more of the relevant authorities and communities and so on. And it's very expensive to run the COP as well. And so Glasgow will have spent an awful lot of money hosting that, some of which will be paid for by the UN and some of it won't. So there are reasons for these things, but you're absolutely right. It would be far better for the whole process to be owned and run by the countries that are most affected. And one of the things you consistently see is, we had an example of it this time around, where the agenda is set by the richer countries, and the needs of the poorer countries are kind of lower down. We'll get to those later. The kinds of targets that are set. So I think one of the reasons why we have to talk about racism in climate change, even though it's difficult, is because we can see the effects of racism in the decisions that have already been made. And I think one of the biggest examples of that is the decision to focus on 2 degrees rather than 1.5 degrees. Because who misses out between those two targets? The temperate world, those green countries I mentioned earlier, will be all right at 2 degrees. we won't be unaffected, but it's not life and death for us. But it is life and death for many parts of sub-Saharan Africa or for small island states. And so by choosing to focus on 2 degrees rather than 1.5, the world has basically sent a signal that says your cultures, your homelands are disposable. Saving you will be a stretch goal, something that we hope to do, but it's not essential. And that, I think, is fundamentally racist when you think about who's going to suffer because of that. So yes, it absolutely should be, these conversations should be hosted and controlled more by the people most affected.
Okay. Many companies in developed countries have now committed to become net zero, and some are asking those in their supply chain to also be net zero. And this is a question: would it be fair to demand suppliers or partners from lower income developing countries to be net zero?
Well, there's a couple of different things going on there. One is the problem of net zero itself, in that if you're net zero rather than zero, you are obviously relying on being able to offset a certain amount. So you're going to have this amount of emissions, and then you will have this amount of carbon being absorbed, and therefore it becomes net zero. A lot of countries, in order to achieve net zero, are expecting to be able to buy offsets in other countries. So Norway, for example, is planning to achieve net zero by reducing its emissions a little bit and then planting forests in lots of places around the world. You're expecting other people to soak up your carbon, basically. So as soon as we start talking about everybody doing net zero, then we have to stop and think, well, hang on a second, if everybody's going for net zero, where's that extra net coming from for carbon absorption? We can't all plant forests. We can't somewhere else. We can't plant forests on the moon to suck up our carbon. Somebody has to be drawing down more carbon than they're emitting. And there's a racial dynamic to that as well. Why are we expecting African countries to plant trees and soak up our carbon? Why are we not taking responsibility for ourselves? There's an issue there. There's a form of colonialism there that says we're going to use you as our carbon sinks. That's worth considering. This is the practicality question about net zero. Yeah, there are other aspects to it as well. Sorry, I've lost the thread of the question now, but can you repeat the question? Because I did have one other thought.
It was about whether countries or suppliers from the areas that are most vulnerable should be also committed to net zero if they're in a supply chain.
Yes, that's right. Yes, so the second aspect to that is we need to focus on the countries that have the highest emissions and reduce emissions there first. We saw the contrast earlier between Australia and Madagascar. If you were to go into climate negotiations and demand that Madagascar reduced its emissions by 90%, because we're trying to reduce ours by 90%, that wouldn't be remotely fair. We're talking about a 100, a factor of 100 in the difference between those two. So that's simply not fair. There are lots of developing countries that are already reducing their emissions, but we saw how that gets complicated in Glasgow when India was saying, we have a big population, you look at our per capita emissions and they're very low. Why are we being constantly pushed to reduce our emissions when our emissions are lifting people out of poverty as they get energy for the first time? And the rest of the world going, just please don't do it with coal. And India going, we are going to do it with coal, and there's nothing you can do about it. And you can see the tension there, because I understand India's position that you want to lift people out of poverty, and coal is what you've got. So these difficult situations, there has to be an understanding of differentiated responsibility and more leeway for developing countries. Ultimately, we all need to get to zero in the end.
Definitely. And one final question: what's the role of education? Because so much of this is about our beliefs and acculturation. What can we do there?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because it's possible in Britain at the moment to get all the way through high school and not know about climate change. I'm working with people here in Luton who are doing education projects with young people, and they'll do a workshop and nobody knows who Greta Thunberg is. Nobody can explain how climate change works. It's been completely ignored in the curriculum. It might come up if you study certain subjects, but it's quite possible to get all the way through school without ever hearing about it. And that really isn't good enough. We're completely failing our young people to not give them even the basic information about the most important issue that they're going to face. It's not like that everywhere, and it will obviously depend on which school you go to. Some are going to have very active teachers who care about this stuff, but it's a lottery whether you hear about it or not at the moment. And that has to change. I think there's a huge education piece for adults as well, because plenty of people have come through the educational system before we knew about climate change. I didn't learn about it until into university. So education is going to be very important. And as always with these things, it's about relationships and taking the time to explain it. It's not enough just to do sort of public information campaigns. We've had those before. It's about the patient work of talking to people and explaining it. They say that change moves at the pace of relationships. And that's where I think the climate movement can really be useful, not just in protesting about stuff, but in doing that hard work of meeting people and talking to people one at a time and explaining it to people.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And, from my perspective, what I love most about your book is it does really enable you to have quite a profound shift in mindset. And those are the books I always enjoy most, that really challenge my view of reality. And for those of you who've not read it, I really encourage you to read Jeremy's book. So thank you very much. And I'll hand back to Peter and Chris.
Good.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Paul, for facilitating that, and Jeremy, thank you for a brilliant talk. I think there is a hand up from Colin, if you'd like to answer the question, and if anybody else would like to ask a question by putting their hand up physically or digitally. Colin, please ask your question.
No, that's just an applause. Thank you very much.
Okay, and same from Lucy, I think. Sorry, an applause from Lucy. Okay. In any event, anybody have a question? I think. Oh, Chris, you have a question.
I do. Thank you, Jeremy. That was it was very informative. Great. Thank you very much. I suppose one of the things you're talking about education with regard to climate change. My generation were very lacking in education about the empire and colonialism. And I came across a book which you may have read by David Oluesco on being Black in Britain. And 4 generations of my family have read this, from a 12-year-old, like my grandson, to my daughter, to myself, and to my father, who's 99, none of which knew about this information. This wasn't available to them in their education or anywhere that was accessible. And I just wonder what you think about that. Climate change should certainly be on the curriculum, but we choose not to talk about this. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there's so much that we don't include in our story. And I sometimes think about slavery and how we tell the story of slavery through the lens of abolition. And so as Britain, we get to congratulate ourselves for abolishing the slave trade and forget that we started the slave trade and benefited from it for 150 years before we abolished it. And we have that tendency of focusing on the good bits of history and ignoring the ugly bits. The British Empire, the moment you step out of Britain and view it from somewhere else, it's a completely different story. And so just for example, where I lived in Kenya, there was a rebellion essentially against the British occupiers in the 1950s called the Mau Mau Rebellion. And it led essentially to almost an entire tribe of people being put in concentration camps, not far from where I went to school. That's still in living memory for some people. Queen Elizabeth was queen at the time, and we were talking about almost 1 million Kikuyus in concentration camps in the British Empire. Nobody knows that story outside of Kenya, really. It's just, we've not told it. We've not acknowledged it. We've never taken responsibility for it, but a complete atrocity. Still within, as I say, the rule of Queen Elizabeth. I think that will change, and I think that will change quite slowly. But there will come a point where we have to start thinking about our for the legacy of these things and the reparations that are owed to people. I suspect that time of reckoning might begin when the Queen dies, actually, which is a very difficult conversation for British people to have, because there'll be such an affection for the Queen, such a respect for the Queen. But inevitably, that will be a moment that we can see coming at some point, if we think honestly about it. That will be a moment of reckoning for us. Yeah.
In your book, you mentioned about educating ourselves, and Peter's going to put in the chat some of the books you recommend, the fiction books that you recommend. And I went to the library, and there seems to be a tokenism when it comes to Black writers, that they'll put them out on display, or we can find them very easily when it's Black History Month. Yeah, they're quite difficult books to get hold of, and I just wonder whether, for instance, your book and the book that I've just mentioned, that a way of spreading the word is to actually order them from your library, because they may not have them in there already. So then not only are you benefiting, but so are many other people who can go and borrow books. And also book clubs. People could read these books very easily in book clubs and inform and educate themselves. So yeah, I just think there's more ways of getting this information out there, as you say. And I found it very helpful reading fiction written by Black writers as well. So thank you for that. I think Peter's put it in the chat now.
Just the names of the authors, not the books. But and just to remind people that we will be putting a newsletter out with links to some of these books, links to the recording of Jeremy's talk. And before I stop recording, are there any other final questions that people would like to ask, or is that it? Okay, so officially, I'd like to thank Jeremy for his talk and for the contribution of questions that you have. So thank you, Jeremy.